Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Martin Miles. I would like to welcome you to the sixth session of Sitecore Headless Development User Group here. This user group is a very recent user group. It started by the fall of previous year, but it appeared to be the both most in demand and the most frequent user group of all in the United States we have. I aim to run it on a monthly basis. It does not happen at every single time, but at least this is the intention. So we invite speakers from the community who have really good experience in headless development with Sitecore. All the topics are valid. Headless development, yes, please welcome. Next.js, please welcome. Anything related to Experience Edge, maybe XM Cloud, that's also welcome. So everything like that is very much relevant. Please always reach out to me and I will be able to accommodate for one of the following events, maybe next month, maybe in a month from now. So let me introduce the speakers for today's session. We have two speakers for today. We have Chang. Probably George does not require introduction. Everyone knows George. He's a 8-time Sitecore, one of the most experienced speakers. And George is active player in the headless area. And we also have John Rappel. For those who don't know, John is a very active participant of headless channel in Slack. And I was amazed by his knowledge. That's why I reached out myself to John, asking him to invite and he can to participate, and he kindly responded back. So John will tell us about optimizing Experience Edge Reliance. And if we are going good with time, we will have a round table. If you have any questions or hot topics you want to bring for the bigger audience for discussion, you are welcome to. So before I pass the control to the first speaker, I want to introduce the biggest changes in headless world. And that was the release of the Headless SDK 22. It was long waited, it is there. From my side, I want to say it has breaking changes. So if you want to upgrade your existing code base, please account bigger time for doing that. I spent afternoon yesterday upgrading my code bases, and I noticed that the code base itself upgraded successfully. Everything works nice and smoothly under SDK 22. However, some dependencies like Storybook and other bits, they still need time to be invested and some troubleshooting required. So consider wisely. I think I will share the guide about upgrading to the latest version soon. The best place you may search for it is in Sitecore Telegram channel, and we have a dedicated Sitecore Telegram channel for headless development. All the news, all the hottest stuff is published there for your convenience. So basically all you need to do is you sometimes open your mobile phone and see all the hot news. Right, so with that in mind, I am passing the control to George. I think, Josh, you already are the host.
Oh, so yes, I am.
Sharing it. And please welcome.
Thanks, Martin. Really appreciate it. I feel like I do need some introduction. So my name is George Chang, and I've been working in the Sitecore space for a good amount of time, probably about 10 years or so. I've lost count. It's been a while, maybe a little bit more. Anyways, really loved working at Sitecore. Loved kind of watching how the product has moved over time, and I'm really excited to tell you about a little bit about kind of my learnings and some of the work that we've done as far as how we use CSS with Headless SXA and XM Cloud. So that's where we'll begin. So for those of you who aren't familiar with Headless SXA, so SXA is the Sitecore Experience Accelerator. It was originally created as a module for regular non-headless Sitecore on-premises Sitecore, the traditional MVC Sitecore. And it came with a lot of basically opinionated ways to kind of structure your projects, and a lot of kind of out of the box components and opinionated ways of things like how you theme your projects. And so when Sitecore moved more towards headless, a lot of that went away, but what wound up coming out of it was what was called Headless SXA, which basically took out all the good parts of SXA. I think are the good parts. There's still a lot of the opinionated kind of site structure. You have this idea of tenants and sites, and a global data folder and settings and local data sources. And basically, if you use XM Cloud, that's the default structure that you get in XM Cloud, right? So whenever you spin up an XM Cloud instance, you go create a tenant and a site and everything, you get that tree structure already pre-created. That's all, you're already in a Headless SXA site. But Headless SXA is also available in XM and, or technically only XP. I don't know why I put XM and XP, but technically XP for SXA, and since SXA only supports XP. So you can use Headless SXA whether you're in XM Cloud or you're on premises, but if you're still using a headless implementation on premises. All right, so this is all about CSS. So we're going to focus a lot about how we style web pages with SXA. And so the legacy SXA, the traditional MVC SXA, this was done by what was called themes. And so historically, SXA had a bunch of base themes. You can see them on the right. There's a lot of them. These are all themes that came out of the box. They supported a lot of the out-of-the-box functionality. They supported all the out-of-the-box components that SXA comes with. You can tell it's a lot. Each of those themes have typically a JavaScript file, some minified optimized JavaScript files, and some CSS files. The JavaScript is the whole theme structure and modules for SXA themes was all based on jQuery. But at the end of the day, it's a lot. Whenever you load in a site, it basically loads in all these themes and all the corresponding JavaScript and CSS files, and it can get really heavy really quick if you load everything in. So it's not a fan, especially if you've kind of worked in the front end, you want to try to minimize and optimize for performance and speed, but rather kind of out of the box, you're loading in, a dozen or two different JavaScript and CSS files. But this is traditional old legacy SXA. We're not here to talk about that today. Let's talk about how we typically would do CSS in Next.js or React. In this case, both of them are pretty much the same. And in a lot of other JavaScript frameworks, they're all very similar as well. How do we write CSS in this new world of Next.js and React and everything? So out of the box, when you spin up a new project, by default, you get kind of the what I call plain old CSS or Sass, right? This is the CSS or Sass that we all know and love. It's a globally scoped file, right? So anytime you write a class, it's globally scoped across all your components. Because it's the most common, it's the most baseline. Most libraries are easy to pull in. So out of the box, Bootstrap comes in, and Bootstrap 5 comes in as part of a headless, the boilerplate headless project. And really, there's nothing wrong with this. It's just globally scoped. You got to manage. You really have to manage your scopes, right? When you have how you have classes in one layer of your project, and then how that cascades down. You really have to understand CSS, the cascading part of CSS, to be able to properly use this, which is fine. This is how front-end development CSS has worked for forever. But as front-end development has progressed over the years, we have a few more options that we can look to use. So one of the first things is Tailwind. Basically, with Tailwind, instead of writing CSS in a CSS file, they've effectively transformed all your CSS properties into classes, right? And so you can see, hopefully you can see a little bit on the right. There is no CSS file that you have to manage outside of that. They're all class names that specify very specific classes for each of those properties. Basically, this is CSS without ever having to write a line of CSS, right? But the other flip side is that there's not a whole lot of cascading. You're not really writing styles. There's no external sheets. And the whole scoping bit of it is a little bit fuzzy because everything is globally scoped, and therefore you have to override styles kind of one level at a time. It's got a lot of traction in the front end world. A lot of people really like it. I think it's a preference thing for people, whether they like it or not. But people complain that it puts a lot of weight on their HTML because you wind up with HTML elements that have 45 classes attached to it if you get a really complex, a lot of complex CSS on there. JavaScript frameworks also give us this idea of what's called CSS in JS. And the Next.js variant of this is called style JSX, but they all operate similarly. But basically the idea is that you would write your CSS as a JavaScript inside your JavaScript, right? And so you can kind of see a little bit on the right, You have your regular CSS, but it's written in a JSX tag, right? Just how you would have JSX tags for HTML in your React implementations. The nice part about this is that it's scoped to a component. So if you give a class, if you're creating a component and you're creating a button class and you call that class button, and then you define that class in this JSX file, that class button will only affect that one component. If you have another class called button in another component, it won't take on that style. So it's very narrow and it's very scoped to the component itself. You get the advantage of everything's in the same place, right? So you basically have all your styles inside the same JSX as your HTML for your component. And with style JSX, it works right out of the box with Next.js. So it's an interesting way to approach this. All right. And then we come, oh, right. Personally, not a fan. I feel like this really adds to your you're mixing your styles in your HTML, and it doesn't rub me the right way, basically. And then I'll come to what I feel like is kind of the happy medium between all of these, kind of the best of all worlds, which is CSS modules. And this isn't anything new. CSS modules has been around for a little while, but it's evolved over time. But the greatest thing about CSS modules is that it is also scoped to a component, right? And so at compilation time, it'll actually hash your CSS classes, and so that you get a unique CSS class per component. And so the same thing applies if you have a button class on one component and a button class on another component. You can define very different styles for those, and you don't actually have to scope them. They're already pre-scoped to the component. You still use Sass. You can still use everything else. You can keep your files out separate from your JSX. It's like you're just writing regular CSS or Sass, but you're importing them into your component rather than writing them in line. And at compilation time, the magic happens where it parses through your classes and basically hashes them to be scoped at a component level. This also works out of the box with Next.js. You can use this today. So if you go create a CSS file or a Sass file and then you import it, you can have that kind of scoped class usage today. So it's actually very easy to move from your global CSS to CSS modules. You import your CSS file and then you tweak your class names on your JSX, then you're ready to roll. I like this because it keeps that proper separation of styles and JavaScript and HTML. And I like my peanut butter in one place and I like my chocolate in another place. Okay, so we've talked a lot about styles and CSS and all this stuff, but none of this really has to do with Sitecore specifically. And so one of the biggest things that we need to accommodate for with Sitecore specifically and SXA specifically is the grid system that SXA provides, right? And so some of you who work in XM Cloud will be familiar with this little layout screen on the right. Basically, this is those adjustments where you can adjust like how many columns wide you want your component to be, and then if there's any offsets or stacking and all this stuff. This is where content authors can go in and resize their components for better or for worse, giving them quite a bit of power there. But we need to be able to accommodate for this as part of our CSS. So out of the box, SXA comes with a bunch of standard grids. So Bootstrap 5, 4, 3 goes. These have been grids that have been around for a while. As SXA has progressed, they've been adding more modern grids. So it started with Bootstrap 3, and then as Bootstrap 4 came out, Bootstrap 4 came along, and then Bootstrap 5 came out. Bootstrap 5 got added. The most recent addition is the last one, which is Tailwind. So the Tailwind grid is now in SXA as of, it's already in XM Cloud, and it's been added to SXA on premises Headless SXA in 10.4. So these are all the kind of the grid layouts that you can use as part of SXA to control that size. So a lot of options, but when you start with creating a boilerplate project, right? You can use Create Sitecore JSS, or you can use an XM Cloud starter kit. And so when you use Create Sitecore JSS, the out-of-the-box standard default grid, it is Bootstrap, and if you look in your package.json for the boilerplate project that gets created, it actually has JSON as a package that installs by default. Then with XM Cloud Starter Kit, it's actually the same story. It also has Bootstrap 5 as a package by default. If you look closely at what it imports and everything, it actually imports the entirety of the Bootstrap library, which is not small. In fact, it's about 223K altogether for that entire library. Sitecore does this because this ensures that the SXA grids work, because by default, the SXA grids all use the Bootstrap grid. And so having that CSS there and being able to, and compiled with your application, it guarantees that the grid classes that SXA needs are there. But 223K is a lot of Ks for just to support grids. That's a lot of weight, especially if you're writing your own custom CSS and you're not using Bootstrap, anything else Bootstrap. You have 223K just to support your grids. And we're looking for speed, and we're looking for optimization, and we're looking for performance. And so what are your options, right? Really, your options are you use one of the default grids, which has that size problem, right? With Bootstrap, any of the other ones have a similar-ish problem, whereas it is still pretty hefty. These are not grid-specific libraries. These are larger CSS framework libraries, and so they come with a lot of weight that comes along that you may not wind up using. The second is you could create your own grid definition, and if anyone on this call has ever tried to do this, it's a lot. If I remember correctly, it's like 124 different items in Sitecore that you have to go and create and specify classes on, and it's crazy. It's a lot. And then your third option is, you know what? Forget the content authors. We just won't let them resize anything. We're just going to make everything fixed, and we're just going to take away that whole the whole grid resizing bit, and we're just not going to let them do it. So we're going to assume that that's not an option, right? Because content authors they want things that content authors want, and that's probably one of those things. So we're going to assume that's not their option. So we've already kind of seen the pitfalls of using a default grid, right? And the pitfalls of writing your own, right? And we've talked about how Bootstrap 5 is 223K. Remember that number, 223K of weight that comes along just to support the grid. And so maybe we look at Tailwind. Tailwind is something that we can, maybe it's a little bit lighter. It's it's a lot. It's classes for every line of code. It should technically be lighter. If you look at the grid CSS for Tailwind that SXA provides, that file actually weighs in at 759K, which is way worse than Bootstrap. And so that's not going to be an option. That's it. You're dropping in 3/4 of a meg of CSS to do, especially if you're not using Tailwind to do just Tailwind, or to just do just handle grid related, resizing grid related activities. Again, creating your own grid, it's a lot. You basically have to create each one of these items and then go assign classes to each one of these. And then that's what Sitecore uses to assign the right class to your component when it needs. I was wrong. It's 294 class items. It's a lot of class items. You can do it, but it's a lot and you have to maintain it. And it's just not any fun for anyone. So what do we do? And really, why not take the best of both worlds, right? I don't want to manage my own grid system, but the out of the box ones are too big. And so we're going to go look at our friend tree shaking. And so if you ask ChatGPT what tree shaking is, and this is from the new ChatGPT 4.0, tree shaking with CSS is a technique to optimize style sheets by removing unused CSS rules from the final output, reducing file size, and improving load times. And if you ever wonder what image ChatGPT gives you, if you ask it to generate an image of someone shaking a tree, it's not actually this image. This image is what you ask ChatGPT after it gives you an image to just give me an image of that, but a man shaking a tree more violently, that's the image that gives you. So that's not really what tree shaking is. You're not actually shaking a tree, but really what tree shaking with CSS is that you basically get rid of all the classes that you weren't using, right? And so that lowers the size of your CSS files to be a lot smaller. So let's look at that Tailwind example that we had earlier, right? With all those classes that in there. I've basically extracted out all the classes that are in this component, which is, what is that, about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 8, 16 different classes. Each of those classes are probably one line of CSS each. When you run Tailwind will actually tree shake everything out and generate a CSS file with just those 16 classes in there. And that file winds up being, I don't know, maybe a K or two, right? 2K tops, right? It's very, very tiny. Now you can do this. This all kind of depends on how much you have in your how much you have it in your components. But since the grid classes are dynamically injected by Sitecore as you render the page, right? Tailwind doesn't know what classes it's going to pick up, and then it's not going to know what grid classes content authors select. So we're going to have to accommodate for basically all of them. So we're going to use this to our advantage. Basically, what we're going to do is we're going to take Tailwind, we're going to ask it to tree shake everything, right? Don't give me any classes except for the ones that are related to the grid. And so Tailwind has this configuration called safe listing, and so you can say, hey, always generate these classes as part of my as part of my CSS class. When you tree shake everything, always tree shake everything except these classes that I specify. So I've taken all the classes that the grid uses and then put them into the safe list. And so again, if you remember our good old favorite number, 223K of our default Bootstrap 5, once we tree shake everything except for the grid classes, Tailwind only nets us 21K, right? And so, which is 1/10 of the size of the regular Bootstrap, which gets you 21K is a lot more manageable to support the grid in SXA, and then you can use your custom CSS on top of that, and you're a lot more optimized than you were previously. So I know that was a lot. I kind of breezed through a bunch of this. But basically, as a summary, we have several options for CSS as we've talked about, but don't forget that we have to support the SXA grid in order to support content authors and their ability to use that the column slider for them to adjust the size of their components. We want to always be looking to optimize for performance, right? Performance is key, especially with some of these JavaScript frameworks, you're choosing to use these JavaScript frameworks for performance. So let's not let CSS be the thing that bogs you down, and try to avoid CSS and JavaScript. It really is a lot, and I can't see you getting in anything but problems by then. But again, just my personal opinion on the topic. If you're wondering how that config looks like, that tailwind that I just showed you earlier of this, but the full size one, I actually have a GitHub gist that has that. It's at this tiny URL. You can go to it. It's got the safe list configuration, plus Sitecore actually dumps in a lot of extra custom classes that Tailwind doesn't support out of the box. And so it also has the definitions of those classes in there as well. You'll want to add that as a CSS file as part of your thing. But again, even with those additional classes, it's a lot smaller, and you can optimize for a lot smaller. So that'll save you quite a bit. Anyways, this allows you to use whatever CSS kind of framework that you want, write your own custom CSS, whatever the case might be, and have a very small footprint for being able to support SXA functionality, and be able to, optimize your site for as quick as possible. So with that, I'm going to wrap it up. All right, Martin, I'm going to hand this back to you.
Yeah, I got it back myself. So,
nice.
Yeah, thank you very much, George. That
of course
was really insightful about these style sheets and SXA. Actually, that very resonates to my experience I had as well. And as a backend developer, natively backend developer, I do love Tailwind, of course, without any doubt. One thing I would probably add to your narrative is a very small one, which would be helpful to the modules, is there is a nice package called class name, or it's known as CN.
Yes.
That allows you to concatenate the classes right in this declaration, in declarative way. And it's very lightweight and handy. So if you don't know what is that, you may definitely Google what is class name.
It is very nice. I definitely agree with you. Yeah, and so to your question earlier, Martin, about whole Storybook and everything, if you have component scope CSS, it makes Storybook a lot easier, because you don't have to worry about styles kind of overriding each other. Your styles come with your component and are local to your component. So that's also helpful.
Question. I actually have a question. So when you started with presenting the 3 ways how we do front end, right? And basically what I'm thinking, what would be the right approach for the workflow when the front end is being initially coming from the front end developers? So that will be some sort of static front end. And us as a backend developers, we do introduce, so basically we pass all the props, we pass all the layout from the Sitecore, but we also do introduce some front-end changes in a little manner and then pass it back to the front-end developers. So my personal experience is that I am using a combination of Storybook, and basically backend developer is responsible for what I just described. I want to leave front-end developers entirely agnostic. They should work on their MacBooks without even knowing and touching all that stuff. But we sometimes introduce front-end changes. And for me, the easiest way is to use CSS modules. That does not make happy front-end developers for some reason, because they like front-end styles in more unified way, like more global or more centrally controlled. So I would like to ask, what is your experience to that particular issue?
I personally like CSS modules. I like the segregation. But that being said, we use kind of a combination of CSS modules and global CSS for various things, right? There are some things that definitely just make sense to be global, right? Like across maybe some kind of CSS that we need that's across all components, right? And so having to paste that every time into a component and knowing that has to go into every CSS file, a CSS module file, is a little painful. So there is kind of a combination of both. I do think that the other part of it is also a bit of personal preference as well. But I would say the other part of it is it depends on how your front end developers are working, right? If they're working at a page level where, hey, here's my page and I'm going to build all this HTML, CSS for a page, or are they building it at a component level of here's my page, but I know this is a component, I know this is a component, I know this is a component. That also makes a difference on how you approach that workflow.
Agree. I would say in 70% of the cases that would be a component per component basis, because it's not about that is right. It's about how the project manager tailor their workflow. So they have some sort of Jira or Azure DevOps board, and that's how they slice the work. BAs do that, or whoever is do that. They make this unit of components as unit of work. So you basically have start to do with component and finish with the component. That's why it's so helpful to make them work in isolation, and that's where Storybook comes into play.
Yes.
But Storybook is not about components; it's also about the pages as well. So you do like full pages with components there. It's like a cascade layout, drop down from the page down to the component. So it's all there.
Yeah. I think the nice thing about CSS modules is, after a few times of being bitten of you go change a CSS class and it breaks something else that you didn't know about. Probably after the third time of doing that, CSS modules is the best thing to have ever happened to you.
Absolutely. I never experienced CSS module break me anything, because the way how it comes to front end, it's like 1 in a billion chance that it will match or interfere with something.
Yeah, it's usually a lot smaller. Yeah.
Okay, let's ask the rest of the group. Does anyone else have any questions to George?
I just have a comment, George. So first of all, nice job, George. But I would say we kind of followed the same path that you did. We use CSS modules. And the one thing I would piggyback off of what Martin said. So of course we do things component based, but what we found is, there's a mapping between a rendering and a component in Next.js. Yes. But we break up our Next.js components further than that as needed. So we have common components and then our, what you would call like your Sitecore components. And then our CSS, what we do with our CSS modules actually influences when we may want to consider a common component. So if we find ourselves doing the same thing, styling the same thing in two different components, myself or some other developer is going to say, maybe we make that a common component, move all those CSS styles to that common component. You can still do things in the individual instances of it, but that's just, it's really nice. There's a little bit of legwork to get it set up, but once it's there, everyone loves it.
Yeah. When it works, it's great. Yep, totally agree. Yeah, I definitely have seen that kind of previously as well. The common components. I think I asked this question in Slack one time. I was like, what do people actually call these? Because I'm like, I don't want to call them a component because that's kind of what the Sitecore rendering are. But I'm like, what do people call them? And we got this whole laundry list of various names of what people call them. I'm like, oh, good. None of us agree. Got it.
The good news here is that there will be lots of improvements done by Sitecore on the coming year. I feel a little bit anxious about announcing that because it might appear to have an NDA information. So something about Storybook, something about all that part of work. But if you know, you know. Please stay tuned to this user group. Please stay tuned to Sitecore Telegram channel. As soon as anything happens in this headless world, I immediately notify you guys. And I would love to have you here as speakers if you have anything to share. Right, so I think it's a good time to pass control to John. John, I make you host, and it's all yours.
Cool, thank you. Okay, looks like we're good. All right, so I'm going to not be talking at all about the client side of the Next.js apps. I'm going to be talking a lot server-side stuff. So my talk, optimizing experience edge reliance. So there's a lot to cover. Let me just say that. Let's start out with who I am, for those of you who don't know. So I'm an architect at EPAM. I'm a 5-time MVP, and I had to look this up when George was talking. So I technically have been doing Sitecore for 15 years. And I started in 6.2, and it's been solid ever since then. So I've been doing this for quite a while. You can see some of my socials there, and then my website. And I wanted to provide a little backstory for this talk. So hopefully some of you have read some of the work that I've published, but that screenshot on the right there is just a zoomed out version of my blog. I talk about a lot of things, but lately, really in the last 2 years, well, the last 2.5 years, I've been on Next.js, Edge, not XM Cloud exclusively, but from Edge all the way to the front end, Vercel, all that stuff. So in that time, I really like to make things faster. And that's really what this talk is all about, is just finding little improvements and things. That's something I really enjoy. So before we get into my talk, I wanted to make sure that you guys are aware of this talk. So on March 13th, Rob Ottoman was in the same user group, and he gave a talk. My talk is really, if his is level 1, mine is level 2. And it's really, I'm going to try my best to cover things that may not be obvious. And honestly, if you guys have questions, I'm perfectly fine if you interrupt or raise your hand or whatever. Because this is, you really need to have the prerequisite of Rob's talk in order to understand some of the parts of mine. But what he covers is like what Experience Edge is, which I will touch on. What is it like to publish to Experience Edge? Then the Next.js aspects of it. When you generate a page, what does that mean? When do you generate a page? What happens when you generate a page? All these things that are like critical to this new flavor of Sitecore. SSG versus SSR, which I kind of cringe when I hear people, and I apologize if you guys have apps in SSR. I don't think it should even be a thing, because we have a very complex implementation, and it's all SSG with combinations of ISR. So
John, same, John, same. I'm on the same page.
yeah, Andy Cohen, I couldn't believe it when he said that there's a lot of people using SSR. So maybe this is gonna help convince you guys to not do that. All right, so for those of you, this is gonna be the quick Experience Edge slide. What is it? So it's hard to describe, I would say. It's really an ecosystem. It's not even a single product. It does so many things. And this is the slide. This image is from Sitecore. And I don't think there's any single image that does Experience Edge justice because of how much it does. And this one too. And I think there's one of my pet peeves, and I think I saw a Sitecore employee watching this, but it's this layout snapshot, and really just this combination of, you have your items, you have your layouts, and it's not true. And it makes it more difficult, I think, in some ways. And I will very thoroughly explain why I believe that. But the red rectangles, why I have those, that's really what we're talking about today. So you can see, like, you have the content management role down on the bottom. You have the Edge connector that's installed on XM. That's what actually does the publishing and does the JSON production and all that. We're not talking about any of that. We're not talking about the media CDN. Like I said, it's really an ecosystem. It's hard to say it's a product. We're talking about just the delivery side. Very specifically, it would be called the delivery API on Edge, is what this is almost entirely focused on. Okay, so the question is, so I'm trying to put myself in the various shoes of everyone here. When does the application do something with Edge? Let's just say it like that. At build time. Build time, as the name implies, that is when your application is linted, compiled, when the pages are built. And again, we're always going into more detail with everything. There's a ton of resources available at that time, and we want to take full advantage of that. The next place is at runtime. So this is where 99% of your application lifecycle is going to be. After it's built, if we're talking about Vercel, at least, it gets distributed to the different Edge regions for Vercel. And that's like the static representation of your site. Like actually the physically static HTML files are delivered all over the place. And then all of your backend communication is going to happen through a series of serverless functions. It's either going to be AWS Lambda or Cloudflare workers. And I'm going to try to, again, touch on those because these are all things that I did not know 2.5 years ago, and I learned them. Some of them are more nuanced than others, but when you know what's happening behind the scenes, it makes you a much better developer. But the key point here is at ISR time, you have less resources available, so that you have to take that into account. Client side. So this is kind of the biggest wild card. There are very valid reasons to need to get data out of Edge from the client. It's never directly through the client, by the way. It's when I say client, like your actual application. With Next.js, you always proxy everything through an API layer, but nonetheless, you go to Edge. And because we're talking about the front end application, how much traffic do you have? If you have 1,000 visitors hitting a page in that 1 second, and depends on the data that you're requesting, but that could be 1,000 requests to Edge in a second, and you're going to break the Edge quota, which you're going to see in the next slide. So that's something to keep in mind. And anyways, this talk has tons of techniques for how to avoid that. And then there could be many other completely legitimate reasons that you need to go to Edge for data. Sitecore search during your indexing, depending on how you have it configured, you may need to have a scheduled crawler to go through Edge. So that's still a query to Edge to check for data that is everything against that same Edge tenant. It's all affecting the quota. So you could have multiple projects hitting the same tenant. It's all affecting the quota. That's what this talk is all about. Okay, so how do we do it? We have a variety of techniques. So number one, we're going to reduce the amount of times that we have to get data from Edge. So the best way to think about that is if data has not changed, don't go get it again, because that's unnecessary pain you're putting on Edge. Number two, we're gonna reuse things, many different ways to cache. I guess I never really built the structure out, but there's a lot. At least 4 different layers of what you would call caching, where you're storing something in a memory location, we'll say. And all of them come into play here. We combine requests. So instead of making 5 requests on a page, can you make it 2 by putting many of them together? And we learned this the hard way, I'll be honest. We were one of the first teams to adopt Edge, and we kept hitting the quota for the most mundane things, and that's because we were just using GraphQL everywhere. Well, that was not the best way to do things. All right, so why are we having this conversation? Number one, I would say, is cost. So one thing that I definitely heard before I got as involved in this as I am now is when you statically generate a site and you statically host it, it's really cheap. And it is. If your site does nothing, great. Then you've just solved all of the problems. But that's just not reality. And that's why Next.js has middleware, has serverless functions, has Edge functions, because these websites need to do other things. And that's really where the cost comes from. And really every single interaction with Edge is going to go through one of those. It's going to go through one of those. I put it in my notes here. Everything with Vercel is charged in gigabyte hours. So it doesn't matter which one that I mentioned, middleware functions, Edge functions, they're all gigabyte hours. So it's really how much memory does it use? How long does it take to run? There's your charge. And then you can go take that calculation, put it in Vercel's chart. We do this for time. Time is money. From a development point of view, from a testing point of view, even from a content author publishing, and they want to see their changes sooner. Everything in this talk affects all of those things. So it's just, in general, when you do things better, do things faster, everyone's going to be happy, and you really spend less time and less money. All right, here's our friend, the edge quota. For a while, people didn't think it existed, and I had proof that it existed. What I will say is, after going through this as much as I have, we don't ever hit this ever. We get more data out of Edge now than we did a year ago, and I have not seen a 429 error in a year. And so just to explain that a bit more, so Edge allows you to make 80 requests per second. It's actually a limitation set on the Cloudflare web application firewall that Edge uses. Again, that's another piece of information that I think is valuable. It's public information, and I can demonstrate it. It's actually part of one of my demos, where Cloudflare only allows these 80 unique requests per second. So again, that seems like a lot when you start like crunching the numbers in your head. Like, man, I can really fire off a lot of stuff though. Like, really, 80 requests in a second, is that 80 pages? Well, no, because every page has at least one request for the layout, and it probably has a couple more. So, realistically, you might be talking 25 pages a second, but that's only one head. What if you have multiple heads hitting the same Edge tenant? What if somebody is just doing another activity? What if a developer is testing? There's all these things that impact the quota. So anywhere you can reduce it, the better. Like I said, I think this is really fun. It's really cool when you hypothesize on something, you test it, and then you implement it, and you can see the results. There's a ton of that in this talk. Really for peace of mind. So the less reliance you have on Edge, the less number of open sockets you have, the less problems there are. Anyone that's been connecting to Edge knows there are transient issues, and they just go away. They happen once, or they happen in a flurry like 50 times in a second, and then they never happen again. So the less you have to ask of Edge, and I'm not trying to knock the product. This is a kind of the nature of the beast. And this is also why in the later JSS library updates, there's a retry mechanism. So we found that out. We've had retrying for 2 years now, just to help out this stuff, because it would, you would try to reproduce the issue and you never could. But then, on a random Friday, this thing would error out, and now this page isn't updated. And so anyways, the less you have to do that, the better. Okay, so to set the stage, where can we look to find ways to optimize? And there's really 2 locations. So the first one is at build time. So like I said before, there's a ton of resources available. The way I think about build time is, like, when I say it's run on a server, it truly is. And by the way, the next slide is going to be a demonstration of this. So I picture a virtual machine with a dedicated CPU with, say, 64 gigabytes of memory. It's actually a machine. So what can you do with that? You have a lot of memory. You have a lot of available sockets. And so we want to harness all of that power. Also, this is where SSG occurs, so static site generation. There's all these acronyms. They all do the same thing, kind of. This is where a page is built. It physically creates HTML, and that is your static site generation. Also, Vercel will naturally run your page generation in parallel, and you can modify that. We can talk about that after if needed. So what does a build do? It creates a static pages, like I said. It also generates your functions. Those get distributed to the network, the Vercel network. It creates all your client-side needs. So a lot of stuff that George talked about, that's where you see kind of the fruits of your labor in the build summary. You can see the CSS files and JavaScript that were produced. Yeah, there we go. All right, so demo time. For those of you that are not aware, so again, this is a very Vercel-centric talk. But what we're covering right now is, it's not really Vercel, it's just a Next.js build. So what we're showing here is we use Vercel CLI. I think that's becoming standard. It depends. Vercel works really well if you have a GitHub repo, but if you don't have a GitHub repo, you have to like use the CLI to tell it what to do. So we fire a zip off of our build, and then it runs entirely on Vercel. And there's just a couple things to point out here. So, okay, this is a little bit of show off time from my notes here. So this is a very old build, over a year ago. It ran for 5 minutes, and my notes say there was only 157 pages generated, so just early in the life cycle. And then here's a more recent one after many of the pieces of this talk were implemented. So half the time, this is only 2 weeks ago, and instead of 157 pages generated, we have, how many? 556, yeah, 556 or so, 567 as my notes say, but way more pages in far less time, and it's all because of the little improvements that we were able to make. Now, another piece to call out though in the build logs. So I mentioned that this is a playing field. So this is where you can identify things. So notice a difference between my two tabs here. Notice how the size of this scroll bar, I'll try to use the metric system. That's about 2 centimeters. And if we go over here, we're probably closer to 1 centimeter. What I'm trying to show here is this build log is significantly longer, and it's not due to the number of pages, but in this case, what I did is I enabled logging. So in this case, what I have enabled is Sitecore JSS HTTP logging. So I mentioned this, whenever needed in the Sitecore Slack headless channel, when people are diagnosing things on their rendering host, which is Vercel in our case, enable logging. And there's different flavors of logging. So this uses there's a debug module that's you can just pull down from NPM, and then you have specific namespaces. And thankfully, JSS was written with a variety of namespaces. The namespace is the HTTP part. And I also have an example of the layout namespace right here. And all that does.
Can I step in for a second, please?
Absolutely.
Yeah, so everything you described now at the moment, this was very much in detail explained and showcased in the very first meeting of our user group by Corey Smith. So he explained exactly in details how and what you do in order to debug your Next.js application. So if you ever have a need, like John says, when you need to reproduce something, as people on Headless Slack channel will tell you to do, follow this guidance from Corey Smith from the first user group. And there might be more about these namespaces John is talking about, and he will explain it all in action and actually show in action.
Yeah, that was really it, Martin. So that's good that Corey went over that. I just wanted to let everyone know that's really all that was for. It's a tool to put in your tool belt, especially when you're diagnosing why are we hitting the edge quota, for example. So at build time, let me go back to that actually. So at build time, we'll go here. It's kind of a double-edged sword. I'm saying there's plenty of resources available, so use them. However, Edge still has that 80 requests per second quota, and at build time, that's when you're trying to get as much out of it as possible. And so if you're hitting that quota, number one, that's going to show up as an error in your logs. And if you do not have debugging on, you're not going to know which page caused it. You're not going to know which request caused it. But if you have HTTP logging and layout enabled, those are your two primary, and dictionary, I should say. Out of the box, those are the only 3 that are ever going to hit Edge. And so before your error happens, you would be able to see, oh, this is what's happening. But like in our case, we use it just more in general, especially if we're testing something that's eliminating and a call to Edge. I want to see the proof of it. I want to see the build before it and then the build after it with the logging enabled. And I can very clearly see that, okay, we went from 4 calls to 3 calls, for example. Okay. Next place that we can optimize is at runtime. So again, this is where 99% of your site is operated. I already mentioned that your serverless functions run on AWS Lambda. So one thing that we've learned is that you can a lot of times go to Vercel for support. But when it comes to the serverless functions, you really are just getting told all of the requirement or the limitations of AWS Lambda that you can just look up independently yourself. So the size of the data that you can send back and forth, like during a page revalidation, which would be an ISR event, is smaller. Then that's because of AWS. And one thing I always remind my team, even when you see the term serverless, it still runs on a server. I don't care what anyone says. And we've seen that in Vercel's use of Next.js and AWS, if we need to, let's say, regenerate the entire site, we fire that off, it will stick to the same serverless function for, could be several minutes. So from my point of view, if you're on the same server for even 1 minute, the number of requests that you can send is a lot, and therefore the number of requests you cannot send is even greater. That means you can rely on memory caching, which is a technique that I'm going to outline a bit later here. Also, another thing that everyone should be doing. So, it's in Next.js, it's really easy to implement ISR, and this is definitely something Rob covered. But on-demand ISR is really what your clients are going to want. When you publish something, as soon as it's done publishing, you want to go to that page and you want to see the result. You need to have on-demand ISR. Otherwise, clients are going to say, "Why do I have to always refresh to see my content?" and get into the whole issues with the search engine crawlers crawling your old content. And anyways, we can talk about that after. Anyways, that's it there. All right, let me just go through what a run log is and why it's important. So what I'm demonstrating here is just a couple revalidations. So this is that on-demand ISR that I mentioned, but you can really see this view is runtime logs in Vercel. I just happen to have it filtered a bit. And what I want to point out here, though, really where it's helpful, is when I look at this request, of course, it's going to update. Give me a second. But that request is showing the number of server-side requests that were made. This is something that's new. It still says early access. This was introduced probably 6 months ago. But it means that when Vercel went to regenerate this page, it required it to open these network requests. And you can get a good amount of data out of this. So number one, you can figure out what the calls are. You have to extrapolate a little bit. So I know just from doing this enough that the very first call is always going to be your layout query, because you can't get anything until you get your layout query. This one here, so 475 is an uncached request. 170 is more than likely a cache request on Cloudflare. I'll demonstrate that after this. And then we have an uncached request. So it's more than likely layout query, dictionary query, and then I don't know. We have multiple calls on our sites, but something like that. So while you're debugging, though, for example, for us, in the past, I used to see 10 calls in one revalidation. So now you think about your 80 requests per second. If I open up 10 of them within the same second on one request, and now I just do a couple pages, it's very quickly I'm hitting the 80 requests per second. So
we cannot see what exactly is the query for this post request, because in the GraphQL, that's always the same endpoint.
No, you could if I had HTTP logging on. Be careful with it, I will just say, because it's a lot. Just like you saw in the build log, how long my scroll bar was. Yeah, again, I don't have it enabled here, but it would be, there's a window here, like a message field, and it will fill up. And once it fills up, Vercel only shows you the tail of it. So the whole top of it will be gone. And like with with both of them, it will give you, when I say both of them, HTTP and layout, it will try to output the query that was sent and the response that was received. So because of that ordering, and because Vercel favors the tail, oftentimes if you have too much stuff logged, you don't actually get to see the request that resulted in the response. So just keep that in mind. Never enable it in production. It's just way too much data. If you enable it in a non-prod environment, we practice toggling it on, get your build, and then turn it off. It will still run on that build because those environment variables are set at that point in time. But if you forget, then you just really fill up the logs. Okay. All right, so we saw our playing field, and now all of the techniques that I've alluded to, the playbook. So we have caching with Cloudflare. So number one, this is free. Like it's happening automatically, and it's very clear that Sitecore intended that. So it uses, if the request that's made has the same headers and the request payload, then it returns the same response. That's where you get that less than 100 milliseconds typically. That is an out of the box setting for Cloudflare's WAF. And it really just makes sense. Like I'm sure back in the testing of Edge that they realized, like, why are we hammering GraphQL when we don't need to if the same data is being requested every time? It applies everywhere. Any GraphQL request in this entire presentation. So you're going to see some kind of crazy GraphQL requests, but that doesn't, from the Cloudflare's perspective, it doesn't really matter what you do with your GraphQL because it still gets converted to a textual request. Like you can just like view the raw request, and that's the same thing Cloudflare is looking at. And like when I say same request payload, I mean down to the byte. Like what I'm going to do to cache bust is to just enter a space in the query, and that will fool Cloudflare and then make it go get the data fresh every time. So we rely on this for what we call global props. And I just got reminded that George asked me what that was. So for us, global props, and others probably have the same question. So on any website, you have your global data that is the same on every page, the logo, maybe the primary navigation, a lot of the stuff in the footer. You have to get that data for every page because every page, when it's generating, needs it. And so putting that all in the same call in GraphQL makes sure that when one page asks for it, the very next time it's the exact same byte for byte call, then it's cached at Cloudflare. Now we go one step further and we server cache that just to not open up that network request and save 100 milliseconds. But which is still not nothing when you're talking about thousands of pages being generated. But just keep that in mind. Oh, another really important item is it doesn't impact your quota. So that 80 requests per second, if that call is made again and it's a cache hit, you're good to go. You can make that call as many times as you want and it won't affect anything. Also, before anybody asks, to clear the cache, you publish. So that I would say is very reliable. When you publish in Sitecore, it may take a while to get to Edge, but when it's done, that cache at Cloudflare is now cleared. What I would also say is that we have seen the cache clear when it shouldn't clear, where we are relying on it and nobody has published. We have proof of that, and then the cache still clears. Anyways, long story, we opened that up with support and never really got a good answer on it.
So when it comes to the performance, am I right saying that it's all about the complexity of GraphQL query rather than the size of payload in first place?
Well, there's complexity. Complexity will either fail or not. So if it's too complex, it'll just instantly fail. By the time it gets, it'll come back to you and tell you that that query was too complex. So if that's what you're talking about, if you're just talking like querying in general, I would say some of the queries that I'm going to demonstrate are pretty complex looking, but from a GraphQL perspective, they're perfectly fine. Does that answer?
So the execution time does not vary on the complexity of the query itself.
It matters I wrote it in one of my latest blogs. You're always better off writing a single query over writing a batched query over making separate requests. And I will demonstrate that also. So I'll show you exactly what I mean by those. It's really those first two, what distinguishes them. And that's really what I just alluded to, combining multiple calls into one call. There's two techniques for doing that. Sorry for all of the premonitions, and then it takes me a moment to get to the demo. So Cloudflare caching, let's do this first. Okay, so what we have here, by the way, this tool is called Bruno. If you want to talk about it after, let me know. It's a really, really nice tool. What we're going to look at here is I'm going to make a request. So what I'm asking for right now is the layout of this item. It's an item path. So it's relative path of this site. Just give me the layout. That's all I'm saying. And what I notice here, I'm looking at the headers, I get a cache hit. And if I put a space here and I hit it again, now it's dynamic. Now, if I don't put it, if I just leave the request and hit it again, now it's going to be a hit. So that's where I'm saying, and by the way, like this X rate limit remaining. So this is all out of the box Cloudflare stuff. And this is actually telling you what your rate limit is. So in that second, this request impacted the quota by 1 and it knocked it to 79. So it's interesting for sure. Another thing that we did when we were experiencing issues during build time, I would say this is before we understood how logging could help us, was I would purposely have this ready to go while a build was running. And then I would just keep firing this off, I automated it, but imagine space, request, space, request, space, request, just to see how low our limit was going. Because every time I would get an uncached request into Edge, it would give me a snapshot of that second in time. So when I did that, in case anyone else wants to do it, it wasn't that hard to set up. I used Postman for that, and in Postman you can send a series of requests, and I was able to modify each one just slightly. I did the same thing, I added a space to it. And so I could just run that entire collection continuously while the build was running. And then I stored all of the results, and then I could actually track that. I could just paste it into Excel, and I could see a line graph of what the quota was at. I don't have that in the demo right now. That was a long time ago. Let's see. All right, that is it for, we're going to go back to Bruno in a moment here. That was it for Cloudflare right now. Okay, so the next topic. So this one's interesting. So there is this NPM package called memory cache. And this is where you cache data literally in memory. So again, it makes a lot of sense on your local machine. It makes a lot of sense even at build time. But this is where I kind of had that aha moment of serverless functions are still servers, because it's still very beneficial at runtime. In our case, the benefits at runtime are really when we are doing a full site regeneration. Again, we can talk about that after if you guys have questions, but that's another thing you should provide a mechanism to do for your content authors. But in that case, when you're regenerating the whole site and it's already live, that's relying entirely on those Lambda functions. And so those are opening all these different sockets, even if it's cached on Cloudflare, just thousands of open requests to get the data in and out. And we were seeing transient errors. So if we can just not even open it, way better. Also, so this is used in JSS. It's actually used in the dictionary, redirects. It's used all over the place. That's where I first found it. So that team gets all the credit. But I realized everybody should be using it where it makes sense. And so the question is, well, where does it make sense? Is very similar to what I said before. Anytime you're making that same request, yes, it's cached by Cloudflare, but why not cache it yourself? So that's as simple as it is. And as far as how to do it, I do not have a demo of this one because there's not much to demo. It just gets cached in memory, and then there's simply the absence of a call. But it's exactly as you would describe caching data in CS 101. You get the value from the cache. There's nothing in the cache. Go get the value, put it in the cache, return the data. That's all it is. So send this to your front-end developers and have them abstract away however it makes sense for you guys. Okay. All right. Here's one of the cool techniques. So batching. It's core to GraphQL. So I'm not going out on a limb at all when I demonstrate this. It's going to look crazy when I demonstrate it, but it's all part of the framework. And so when I'm going to demo it in that Bruno tool again. If you haven't guessed, I do dabble in the front end, but I'm far more back end design oriented. And so I'm more curious about how things are actually operating under the hood. If I can understand how they operate under the hood, the rest of it comes much easier. But when you get out of the hood and you start looking at the car and you're using GraphQL request NPM library, it's very easy. There's shortcuts for doing all this batching. It is useful when a single query exceeds complexity limits. So Martin, you had that. I don't know if this is where you were going or not, but the complexity is a very defined term with GraphQL queries. But if you run into those issues, you can batch them. And then each one of your queries is going to be subject to its own complexity. And that's how you can eliminate that as an issue. It's also excellent for getting data from non-adjacent locations. Very specific wording because back to my example, why we use this in our global props. That's going to be my demo. We have to get header data. We have to get footer data. We have to get other random site settings data. Some of that data, just because of your information architecture, may not be all next to each other. And you shouldn't be forced to put it next to each other just to make your front end operate better. You can design your information architecture the best way it makes sense for you and your client. With SXA, you have a lot less flexibility. Things kind of go where they're supposed to go. But the same thing applies though. Like depending on where you put your information, put it where it makes sense, and then you can rely on this technique to get the data from wherever you need to. And how does it work? So on the right-hand side here, I talk about it's very similar to JavaScript promises. Let's say you have multiple requests you need to send, and you can just say promise all. And what's going to happen is JavaScript is going to fire off all of those requests, and whichever one takes the longest is when they're all going to complete, and then you can read the data as needed. Same idea here. You send every single one of them over the fence. One of them takes longer than the others. The other ones wait, even if they're done, and then you get all the data back in an array response instead of a single response. Yeah, and like I said, it's a lot cleaner when you use the library. All right, next demo. Okay, so before I show the global props version, so this is a single query. In all of the tooling that I found, so this again is Bruno, even in Postman, they both are pre-configured to work with GraphQL. None of them work with batch GraphQL. And I'll show you why. This is batch GraphQL, batch requesting. So you have an array. So this is, it's JSON, but it's essentially the raw request payload. And it's an array. And then you can see the property here, or the object here. And then each object has a query property and a variables property. Just like in the single request, which has really nice tabs and basically IntelliSense and everything built in, they don't have a configuration that does multiple. But it's the same idea. So you can see this is JSON encoded, but it's still just a query. The variables still are just variables. And if I fire this off and I view the response instead, my data comes back pretty good. So it's still an array. So Bruno does this really well. I don't think Postman does this. I can collapse this. So if I look at Here, I'll even do it in the request. So I have, 3 objects in my request array, 3 objects in my response. And it is a 1-to-1. So I'm looking, I said, it's much harder to read. Like I said, it's so much easier to read this in using the library. Anyways, identity settings. It's actually going to be, I can't even find it. Whatever. You can still see it's a 1-to-1. These are my identity settings that I'm asking for. If I go to the next one, we're looking for legal information. Looks like. Yeah, there's our legal settings. So then we can pull out everything that we need. Okay. That is it for batch requests. Okay, the next technique, combining complex requests. So this was from I think it was my latest blog post. All right, yeah, this is my definition that I came up with. When should you combine complex requests? And the answer is anytime you can pull data based on adjacent items. So you're going to rely on the, I'm trying to think what they're called in GraphQL, fields, I guess, maybe. Parents, children, siblings, ancestors. It does not do descendants. So ancestors is going to go up the tree, but you can't go back down. You can go down as far as children will let you, but you can only do that so many times before it yells at you. So don't yell at me for that. That's just how it is. And again, I'll demonstrate what I mean by that. So back to that earlier comment though, when you can use these combined requests, I've seen that the performance is better. And I think it's just easier to read just from like the backend tooling. You're going to see the request. You can run the request right in Postman or Bruno, and it's just fine. And in the JavaScript code where you're configuring it in your application, you can configure it however you want. It's very easy to read. It looks just like it does in the utilities. Most useful on uncached requests. So like I said, every time you regenerate a page, you will always have an uncached request for the layout. There's no getting around that. And that's really where the idea came for this for us was we knew we had to have a layout request, but then we had extra data. Like the best example was breadcrumbs. Like the breadcrumbs are based on other pages. Like, so if an author updates like the very top level page and changes the breadcrumb title, you got to change that technically on every page beneath it. But one thing we also try to exercise is publishing as little as possible to Edge. We use incremental scheduled publishing. It works fantastic for us. Can certainly talk about that after if you guys want. But in that case, if you modify the parent and publish it, let's say you publish all the children and you want to regenerate all the children. That process, let's say that takes I don't know, 10 minutes to do that realistically, versus publishing one item and then running a command to regenerate just the sibling pages or the child pages, I should say, significantly faster. We're talking like the order of X to 10X. So X being much faster than the 10X initial version that I described. You can have those complexity limits. So back to that other topic. And if you do have that, you can do batch requests. Batch requests, really the only downside is just it is more complex still, even though they have the NPM library that makes it a bit cleaner. It is still more complex than this approach. Okay, so demonstrating combined requests. Okay, so we have, let me make sure. All right. So again, let me move these in the right order. So we have the same page, I won't, whatever. So this is an out of the box using the JSS SDK, the layout query. It goes and gets the property of rendered on the item that you ask for. And we get the data back. And there it is. Again, I go into this much more thoroughly in my blog post. But we get The context is going to be information about the state of things. If we go into the route, so we have the fields that are on the page in question, and then we have the placeholders, which is going to be like the actual JSON representation of your layout of the page. So all of your placeholders, all of your renderings, the data sources tied to those, and the fields of those data sources. Great, that's what you need to generate a layout out of the box. But again, if you need the breadcrumbs or any other adjacent data, that's a second uncached request, because that is always going to be different. Like when I generate this page, the layout is unique to this page. So is all the supporting data of this page. And so combining that into the same layout is the best of both worlds. So that's what we did here. So this is going for the exact same item. And instead of just asking for the rendered property, we're asking for the breadcrumbs. And then I just sort of threw this in there. We're asking for a menu. Let's imagine there's like a sub menu on that page where you want to return the siblings of that page. That's what this is doing. And you can see it's a little bit more complex, but it's no more complex than the individual queries would be. By the way, you should always rely on fragments. Another thing I call out on the JSS Slack channel when I see it. But how does this look when we fire it off? So we can see that our 2 extra fields are aliased. Breadcrumbs context comes from this guy right here. And then we have our menu, which is right here. And so now we have all this extra data, and we still have our render property. So if we do nothing but modify the layout query to operate in this capacity, everything in JSS continues to work, but we're getting extra data along with it. And that's really where we, it took a little bit of legwork. Adam Bauer, who manages the JSS repo, he already added this to the board. This is going to become a core feature of JSS in the future. Again, it just saves, it's less impact on Edge, so I'm sure Sitecore is happy about that.
I want to step in again.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry for interrupting, John. And I use kind of alternative approach. So let's say I have a language selector on a top right corner where I show, allow user to select which language they want this page in. So basically, this is something as a part of a header that is part of every single page. So I use similar stuff, but I put this, so this language is for dropdown. They are coming from somewhere, right? And I need to have them by all the times. So I place these languages into the context. So not in the layout, but into into the layout of it, but to the context of. Like, so you see, you have rendered site context.
Yeah. So you modify, you push .NET code, right?
But yes, that requires .NET redeployment for that.
Yeah, exactly.
So CF customization, in fact. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And that's another, I'm actually glad you brought that up. I didn't put that in my presentation, but
your approach is better.
Thank you. I agree. I mean, there's a lot of trial and error to get to this. And when I talked to Adam about it many months ago, before the blog post and everything, that was his thought was, his first thought was, oh, you can add a, I don't even do it, so I don't remember the name, but yes, it's like a layout context. It's not a rendering contents resolver. It's another thing. But I said, well, that requires a .NET change to XM Cloud. You're not supposed to do that. And he said, you're right. And this technique resolves that. So yeah, exactly. That's why anytime you can not touch XM, the better. Okay.
Hey, John, since you're on a pause. So this technique, you're basically saying you're replacing kind of you're overriding the out of the box call to the layout query with your own query here, and just kind of dumping into the same context that the rest of the application is running.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, and I would say it's very clean. Like the fact that it's going to be added to the core repo, it's going to make it really simple. But we were able to do it very cleanly. Again, I'm not. I just design the things, and then I have front end wizards that are able to like take my crazy and make it really nice and clean. And like I sent the whole pull request to Adam, and it was just like 4 files, a few changes, and it was off and working.
That's awesome. Yeah, I mean, because this feels incredibly useful to be able to batch a lot, like what you're calling adjacent stuff in the same query.
Oh yeah, and I didn't really. Yeah, I'm glad you just said that, because I didn't really show it. So like, I'm not demoing this, but if you can get an introspection result in GraphQL. That's again a GraphQL ism. Google it. Introspection query for GraphQL. You can ask for it. So you can ask. I'll just do one. Let's take a second. I'm going to ask Edge, give me your entire schema, and it will do it. It's going to be huge. You can see how long it's taking. This is not something you would do on your app. This is more of a troubleshooting technique. This is taking. I have tons of samples. If this is gonna, there it goes. All right. So it's still formatting it too. But thankfully, the very top item that it added here is the item. So on the item, we have these fields, and when I talk about the adjacent items, you have to navigate the adjacent items. One of them is the ancestors field. Children is the next one. What else did I say? I can't remember anymore now. There's more. Anyways, that's what I mean by you can only move one item away every single time, but you can do it a few times before it tells you, hey, this is too complex or you're too far away, and you'll get an error. Okay. All right, this is going to be the last technique, and I have not blogged about this one yet, but some people, again, I saw a name in this group. If he's still in here, I know he knows what I'm talking about. But you can implement the cache control header. So this is a Vercel centric. Well, Vercel does it, but Cloudflare, a lot of these different providers do it. So what you have two ways that we utilize the cache control. So Vercel, one of my earlier slides, I mentioned that you get the caching for free in Cloudflare over Edge. You also get access to the Vercel CDN, and you should always use it. I actually want to go to the next slide while I talk about this. What I'm showing here is an API endpoint in Next.js, and it's so critical. Every time you have an API, you should tell Vercel what to do with it. Because if you don't, then you don't know when it's going to be cached, when it's not going to be cached. That impacts how real time is your data. If you're not caching it, how much you're getting billed. Like, are you executing this function when you shouldn't be? And so these headers, you send back in the response, and then Vercel respects its headers, and then your browser respects its own headers. And there's even more of these cache control headers, but I found that at some point it's cached in one spot and it doesn't really matter. If you're going to the cloud, you got to skip over one cloud to get to another cloud. It's still a cloud. We're talking like 1 millisecond of time. It's not worth it. So now back to this. So the Vercel CDN. So every time you have a request that is served by Vercel, you can cache it. And it does say shared between all users. I've found that is region-based, which is why it's really critical to set the CDN, because you might have people doing something on the East Coast, and then you do it and you're in the Midwest. You're like, what are you talking about? It looks fine. And it is actually cached in the different regions. So just keep that in mind. It can have a unique lifetime. So you actually can see these bullet points are intentionally very similar. And that's because you may want to cache data on Vercel for a certain amount of time, but then when it comes to the user's browser, you may want to cache it at a different time. And I showed you a little bit of that on the next slide, and I'll make sure to talk about that, like what we've decided to do. Anyway, you can learn more about it here. Like I said, there's a couple more cache control headers if you need them. But what we did, I'm pretty sure that, yeah, so the way we do this is on Vercel, let's say we cache it for 30 minutes. Then from a user's point of view, we cache it a little bit less. Let's say 10 minutes. So now from a user's perspective, if you like, let's say the data was cleared, like the client is expecting new data to appear because they just published or something. Well, it's going to take 30 minutes for Vercel to clear the cache. Remember, this is a different cache than Cloudflare over GraphQL. But this example, by the way, would be going to GraphQL. Ignore the Solar stuff. Imagine it goes to GraphQL because this could impact your quota. So what we're trying to do in this scenario is don't go to GraphQL. Don't go to Edge. Don't even go to Cloudflare if I don't need to, because now we're in the runtime environment. We're not at build time. So we're at the mercy of our users. So again, my example was like, what if you have a lot of traffic? Why not just prevent things from happening? That's always the best case scenario. So now back to this. So you have your Vercel cache control at 30 minutes, users at 10 minutes, somebody publishes it. The maximum amount of time that users are going to be waiting for that data is 40 minutes. You know, if somebody gets really unlucky, hits it at the end of the 30 minutes in Vercel, and then it had the whole 10 minutes on their user side. But that works really well. In this case, we have this this response called a whitelist. It just determines like which external links have a pop-up and which don't. You guys have probably all written those types of things on a website, and it does not change very often. So it has a very long cache life. It just needlessly was hitting Edge. So we took that away. And this is going to be my last demo. Hope you guys appreciate the number of demos. And before I open this, okay, we'll go to network. Okay. All right, we should see, let me just go to fetch. There we go. So we have our call here. Let me just see what we got back. What I'm looking for here, again, just trying to build up everyone who listens to this, more tools in your tool belt. I'm sure you should be aware of like inspecting element and viewing the network tab. I'm purposely going fast through that. But what I want to demonstrate here is the response headers. So let's ignore the request headers. It's not important right now. What we get back from the response headers, anything with this X Vercel prefix, that's going to tell us what Vercel did. And so what we see here is there was a hit in Vercel, which is fantastic. So that goes back to our Vercel CDN cache control. Again, this has a very long life cycle. I could probably sit here. Well, number one, I'd have to open up a new incognito session every time. But for me to be the user that is the one person that just so happened to refresh the cache it's so unlikely, because once it's refreshed, now it's good for, I think 30 minutes or even longer, however long we set it. So there's the benefit there. The next thing is we need the whitelist on every page. And so the second cache control header right here, this one makes its way through Vercel and gets to the browser, and then lets the browser decide if it needs to get the data fresh. So Chrome is a little bit weird with it sometimes. Sometimes it will get it. Sometimes it typically respects it, but it may, there's an entity tag, yeah, the E tag here. It may go to Vercel and say, hey, did the E tag change? And then Vercel says, no, it didn't. So there's still like a little network chatter, but it's like we're talking on the series of like 2 bytes to do that. It's kind of one of my pet peeves. I wish it didn't even do that, but I can't stop that. But that's the benefit of this client-side caching. And the last thing I will say too, when you're developing, Vercel does this as a benefit. It disables all of this caching. So when you're implementing a new feature like this and you're telling your QA team, hey, this is what you should expect to see, and then they're not seeing any caching at all, it's very fun. But trust me, it works when you get into the production environment. Yeah. And that's it. That's the whole presentation. So thank you all.
I have a question, John. Have you, sorry. Oh, George is clapping. Never mind. First of all, thank you so much for all of your work and your blog post. We really appreciate that personally. And when we talked about combining queries, right? I think we made an example of, doing adjacent or siblings and things of that nature. It is still possible, right? And I don't want anybody to get the wrong impression here, to do 2 item calls in the same query, right, without doing a batch and calling those 2 separate paths, right? So this is a common approach for, if you need some fallback data, something like that, calling 2 items, definitely possible in that same query without the batch approach, right?
Yeah, you're right. I think you have to alias them separately, right?
Yep, exactly right.
Yeah. There's so many things that I've learned about GraphQL. I've probably forgot more about it at this point.
Yeah, but definitely fantastic tips. Thank you so much for sharing this with the community. Yeah.
You're welcome.
Unbelievable presentation. I hardly can imagine how much time did you spend and effort for bringing it all together. But
Yeah, like I said, it's been like 2.5 years. It wasn't this nice in the beginning. Trust me, it was like, ugh. But we slowly got ourselves there.
Awesome. Any more questions to John from the audience?
Oh, sorry, there was some message in chat. Page size issues. Yeah, so I'm trying to remember when we ran into that. Well, maybe not page size, like, so the sitemap query. So at the start of the build, in get static paths, if we talk about like pure Next.js, at get static paths, you have to tell Next.js what are the paths that you want to generate. And so Sitecore uses a sitemap fetcher, and that ultimately runs a sitemap query. And man, I've tried it. Oh, there's I guess a page limit. I think it's 1,000, which I've played with. So, but in general, no to that scenario. But I think it was with that whitelist where we did implement pagination. And so in like Bruno or Postman, you have to, copy it's like an after property, and then you put that in the cursor parameter, and then that's how you can do pagination in one of the backend tools. But in our front end app, in our Next.js application, one of our developers just wrote a shortcut where if you need pagination in something, you just feed your query into that routine, and it automatically extracts the after and then runs the cursor, and it gets all your paginated data. So it's going to run however many pages of data there is automatically. And one thing to remember, back to the presentation, any GraphQL request that is byte for byte the same, header and body, is cached. So even page 5, it will have, as long as your data hasn't changed, the cursor is going to be the same. So even that data is going to be cached. So in that case, like, in other words, don't feel bad if you have to write that routine that has to go through all the pages of the data, because it'll be cached at least on the Cloudflare side. I would still say cache it on the server side, just because. Yeah. Yeah, and by the way, George, I don't think you can change the complexity limit on Edge. So what we did is we've matched our XM complexity limit with Edge after talking with support.
That's a really good call. I didn't even think about that.
Yeah, it's fun to get through all of the development and then deploy it, and then it breaks.
Yeah, you're right.
Right. If there are no more questions, I would suggest move to the roundtable. If you have anything to bring to this discussion among all of us who are here, please shout out, and we will try to collectively discuss and think it over. John, thank you very much for this awesome presentation. This is indeed so fundamental. This presentation will get recorded, and I think I will have to watch it several more times to absorb everything properly and repeat after you.
Yeah, thank you. And you can always look at my blogs. Like I said, pretty much everything is in there. Yeah.
So I'll probably start with the roundtable. The first would be a tip about deploying Storybook, because it's my topic these days. I wanted to deploy Storybook to Rappel, and there basically are two ways how you will do that. The one is if you set up a separate project for your Rappel, which will apply to the same model repository that you have, but in a separate project. Optionally, you may still use this kind of a subfolder, map it to subfolder on the existing site where you run it, but I don't believe that's what you would like to do. So in most cases, you would want to set it up as a separate project. So far, so good. So the catch number one is that basically what happens is lots of what I will be talking now is following what John has explained in the beginning of his speech. I'm using CLI because my code is in Azure DevOps, and this is not supported provider. It's supported for XMCloud, but when you do Rappel, they support GitHub, but not Azure DevOps. So I only left with the CLI. You can use it from Azure DevOps pipelines, but that's still CLI. So when I do Rappel command, what happens? The whole code is sent to Rappel for build. So basically, that's your code base is built there on server. Again, that's what John said. Right. So you have to obviously you have to provide the folder for static output. That's where your Storybook stuff will be run from. But the interesting catch here is I'm using Storybook for pages and for components. So components belong to the same repository, same mono repository. But because I'm not deploying it in normal way, I still have to run the component builder and all this stuff. So basically, I have to bootstrap the thing. So I must execute the bootstrap command prior to running the Storybook. And that was well described by Jeff from Fish Tank and from Sitecore previously. He explained it on, I think, on the second user group here. Okay, that was done so far, so good. And I still was receiving the errors, trying to figure out what the hell is going on, because there were some mistakes. There was a mistake from GraphQL request. So it tried to pull the data from the experience edge. So I was thinking, okay, why do you need that? You actually don't need this data. It's clearly trying to do SSG, but I only want Storybook. So kind of that. The catch was that you still have to provide this endpoint for builds to happen. So because it's kind of same on a repository, you still have to provide endpoint. So it does not terminate on this. It does not break the build when it tries to pull the data. So when it pulls, it still pulls the data, does it unwanted piece of job for the SSD for this repository. But what it will done eventually, it will build your Storybook and deploy into the static folder. So that was a kind of a lesson learned for me.
Now,
That
a
is
couple
one-
things. You're passing environment variables via the CLI, right? Or not?
Yes, I do.
Okay, yeah.
Versal.js file as well.
Yeah, we do a combination. So yes, we have library variables in Azure DevOps, and then we have Rappel ones. Okay, so that's good. The way you're describing it, it depends on how much you want to change. You could customize that to tell it to not even query Edge. But in your case, if it's only a couple extra minutes and it's not hurting anything, then you probably left it, right?
I ended up still making this part of the DevOps build pipeline. So it's not actually me, it was our DevOps engineer. So that every time they deploy, this step is wired to the deployment process, it updates Storybook as well, which makes total sense. And it appeared to be much easier to do it from that build pipeline. So this is my lesson learned I wanted to share with the audience. Maybe it's not that complicated, but just still there. Because I saw lots of questions in the Headless channel about how to do the Storybook and how to do it on Vercel, but this part was not covered. So the second thing I have for discussion is, well, it's bigger thing. Let me try to explain. Maybe I will skip something, but I'll try to get it in real time. So the big piece of this topic is that all the Sitecore architects of Exam Cloud, they tell you that you don't need to bring your custom integrations to CM. Do it to the head. This is point well understood. It is described in the Sitecore Accelerate, so there's no question about it. We came, however, to a situation where we need something of that caliber. So we have external source of data that are coming outside of our perimeter, like different types of data, multiple. And at some stage, we need to get them through authoring API, bring them to CM as the items. So you would say in first place, why would you need to do that? You would probably bring them into head directly. The catch is that we want some of these properties to be editable. So editors must be able to edit some matter of this information, which will be submitted back to the source of truth. So in my ideal picture, I would probably make not CDP, but something like that for persistent storage of that data in our perimeter, because this data is not consumed by CM, where it's published to Experience Edge. But we also have search. In our case, it's Cavero. But the idea is that this data should eventually pass to Cavero and then to the front-end application. So I talked to different architects from Sitecore. Some of them were very strict, saying you need to customize it on the client. But again, editing capabilities and convenience of editing was the first thing I was thinking about. Until the last day, when I came across some interesting blog post that was Christian Hahn, and he posted two blog posts. One was about integrating a custom DIM into your Exam Cloud. And the second would be a continuous of the first post, where he would export external data into your XM Cloud. So the way he made it is he used the right approach on the client, right? But basically, the catch is if you import external DIM other than Content Hub, right, which is supported, you will not get it supported with Pages. So you will not be able to integrate it in Pages in first place. What Christian suggested, basically the Pages interface is built with Chakra UI. And again, if I understood his proposal right. So he does the integration at the head, but at the same time, he kind of mimics the editing capabilities of Pages by using the Chakra UI. And then once you edit the data, you will be able to use, I don't know, like serverless functions maybe, or whatever mechanism you will be able to use to push it back. So that is idea. And the same was for custom DAM integration. That means external images from DIM would be also available right at your head. So by this approach, he does not violate what Sitecore architects are telling you to do. He brings nice editing experience, and yeah, all this type of integration. So I'm thinking about this approach, and I would like to hear your opinion. It's a more open question. What do you think about?
I think it makes a lot of sense. So all of it I know, except the last part, which is the submit, like, so if a user makes a change and they want to submit that change, that's the piece where I'm curious how he's like hijacking that, how he's getting access to that.
I think he's
Because
just calling the GraphQL authoring API, if I'm not mistaken.
But the whole point of this exercise is to avoid calling GraphQL author and API.
Yeah, I don't-
We
he's-
don't have these
he's-
items on CM at all.
yeah, like so when an author makes a change, he's pushing that to the integration, whatever the integration endpoint is. Like I get that part,
Right.
but I'm maybe,
How easy write it back.
well, he's actually, no, he's probably just it's still just going to be, it's all on the head. So he will be able to intercept that and then do whatever he needs to. So he's going to have to abide by whatever the capabilities are of the integration endpoint. Obviously they support probably post and put, some way to modify. And then from the head, if a user makes that change, he could say, hey, refresh the page. And now the data is updated. Yeah, that's really cool.
So we're talking about something like PDP. With the data, like when you build PDP, you will get a lot of external data.
Yep.
And that is about integrating it at the head.
Mm-hmm.
So couple things to add to this picture. So first of all, we do have sync service as the input for when the data comes from the external outside of perimeter. We still sync it with a sync server at our side, and we do some sort of persistent caching because we kind of must have this persistent caching. Then it's kind of a branching where it goes to CM by the authoring API, which itself is not that much reliable. So it works, but I experience some examples of unreliability of it. Or it will go to the head for this type of exercise. And I'm thinking, because I very love this way that Christian presented, but the complexity of building it also is kind of I personally, if I was building that, I don't know how much time I would require to do that.
I know I've had inquiries of, folks wanting to integrate with Vercel's inline editing draft mode capabilities, right? And the approach there fairly similar, right? And Pages is using preview mode just like Vercel is, right? To go hit that post. And yeah, I mean it is rather labor intensive to write the API route that goes back and post that back, but it's definitely doable. Outside of the Sitecore realm, right? Like Vercel, Builder, all of those guys have mechanisms that can write back to data stores. And so yeah, I think Christian's post is definitely intriguing, but it's certainly not without quite a bit of work behind it. And I typically see it being done on a component by component basis, rather than a large write back approach. So yeah, I'd love to try it one day, as I'm sure we all would.
I would say it's probably the scenario specific situation. If you need to, let's say, modify a couple properties and they are pretty much simple, you may do that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and also we're using Vercel, which gives some sort of hope because we can leverage lots of its mechanism of infrastructure, whichever they offer. And we also partners with Vercel, so we can discuss the diagram with them as well. Maybe that would help. Anyway, what I will do is I keep this scenario in mind, and maybe this will be a subject for discussion at the next roundtable for the next event. I would like to find out if any of the group has any interesting findings or gotchas you would like to share with the audience today, similar to what I did? Anything interesting you've done recently? Something non-trivial?
We just implemented code splitting with JavaScript. That was pretty nice using Webpack. Comes with Next.js. So we were able to. There's a guy in the community, Anton. I forget his last name. He wrote a. Yep.
Astro guy.
Yep. He's been great talking to him. Kind of use that as motivation, and then just kept plugging away and chipping pieces off of the JavaScript package that gets generated, and it was really good. Felt good.
That's interesting use case. All right, if there are no other topics, let's call it a day. We are perfectly at the time, 2 hours as planned. Once again, I would like to thank our participants for speaking today. This session is recorded as usual. We're always looking for new speakers. Reach out to me, I will be able to accommodate you. And see you next month. The next event will be 13th of June, and the following will be 11th of July. Thank you, and bye-bye.